Hi, everyone. Welcome. I think we're going to get started. So happy to see so many people here tonight. I'm Dan Byers, Senior Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Williams College Museum of Art. And before we begin our program, I want to thank my colleagues, Roz Cruz and Rebecca Dravis, for organizing and publicizing this series of talks, Devin Nallen for leading our construction site visits, and Class of 1956 Director Pam Franks for her leadership throughout this process. I'm very glad to be welcoming Hugh Hayden to Williams this evening. Hugh is one of 3 artists we have invited to submit proposals for newly commissioned artworks to be installed on the grounds of WICMA's new building. Over the past month, each artist has visited campus to share their work with our community and learn about our site. Following the artist visits, they will submit proposals in early 2026, and the selected artists will return to campus in the spring to meet more community members and work towards the final concept and design of their project, with the commissioned artwork to be installed in the east meadows facing towards campus in late 2027. The new commission builds on a long tradition at WICMA and at Williams of integrating artwork into our campus life. As a primary example, the now iconic and very well-loved Eyes by Louise Bourgeois have welcomed visitors to WICMA since 2001, when it was commissioned for the museum's 75th anniversary. This upcoming commission we hope will create a renewed welcome, signaling the new museum's relationship to its natural surroundings, the campus community, and the collections and exhibitions within the museum. I've admired Hugh's work for a long time, initially dazzled by his technical wizardry and uncanny moving transformation of ordinary objects. I understood the full philosophical weight and urgent social relevancy of his practice when I heard him speak a few years ago. Hugh's fluency in traditions of wood carving, furniture making, contemporary sculpture, and architecture is brought to bear on works that wrestle with the deeply entrenched myths and stories that form and often disfigure our culture. His artworks and installations create conceptually rich environments where metaphors and symbols and turns of phrase transform familiar materials and images into startling encounters. A sly, wise humor often animates this work. Hayden's practice comes out of a deep connection to nature and organic materials, utilizing wood as his primary medium, frequently loaded with multi-layered histories in their origin, including objects as varied as discarded trunks, indigenous timbers, Christmas trees, or souvenir African sculptures. And you can see one of these beautiful sculptures in the woods behind the Clark now as part of their groundwork exhibition. So Hugh Hayden was born in Dallas, Texas, and lives and works in New York City. He holds an MFA from Columbia University and a Bachelor of Architecture from Cornell University. Recent solo exhibitions include public art installations at the Boston Public Art Triennial and the DeCordova Sculpture Park Museum in Lincoln, and the traveling work Briar Patch, which debuted at the Madison Square Park Conservancy in New York. Other solo institutional and gallery exhibitions include American Vernacular at the Frye Art Museum in Seattle, Homework at the Rose Art Museum at Brandeis University, Homecoming at the Nasher Sculpture Center in Dallas, Boogeymen at Institute of Contemporary Art Miami, which traveled to the Blaffer Art Museum in Houston. Hugh Hayden Creation Myths was at the Princeton University Art Museum, and he's had numerous solo exhibitions at Lisson Gallery in New York and London. Hugh is the recipient of residencies at Glenfiddich in Dufftown, Scotland, Abrams Art Center and Socrates Sculpture Park, and the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council. And he holds positions on advisory councils at Columbia University School of the Arts, Johnson Museum of Art at Cornell University, and Cornell College of Architecture, Art, and Planning. And Hugh's work is part of many public collections at the Met, LACMA, the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Whitney Museum, and the Princeton Art Museum. So Hugh will speak for about an hour about his practice, and we'll do a Q&A for 30 minutes. And I'm very happy to welcome Hugh Hayden.
Thank you, Dan, for that introduction, and thank you all for having me. And it's a great turnout to come hear me speak about my imagination. And so this is my format of a sort of slideshow per se. It's kind of a film. Oops, well, let me. And this is a clip from a short film I made in 2014 with a friend. when I was at a residency at the Glenfiddich Whiskey Distillery. And I wanted to use the film as an exhibition opportunity to explore things I couldn't do in a gallery. And so in this scene, I've shot a duck that turns into this sort of fleshy log, which is really just a pork tenderloin and a pantyhose with bark glued to it. And I wanted to kind of convey this idea of like a tree that or is transformed into an organism, thinking about it in a different way beyond how we conventionally think of a tree.
How strange, he thought, to be an animal that's...
Versus this is a sculpture where it's two logs where the log on top is covered with sharp-tailed grouse feathers, sort of using the natural patterning of the feathers to sort of, and their sort of camouflage and trompe-l'oeil effects to sort of deceive the viewer in terms of what's real. But also within my work, I use a lot of camouflage as this metaphor for blending into both the natural landscape, but also a cultural or social landscape.
Ought always to blend in.
So often I'm using tree bark, I'm using branches, feathers. In this case, it's a Burberry coat that was been covered with bark.
Then, sudden as a ghost, he saw the red grouse. And the grouse saw Hugh. The tweed of his...
And so in this short film, I'm like the lord of an estate, and I'm sort of hunting these different birds in the landscape, and there's some surreal and uncanny things happen and transformations. It was shot in 2014, and it's I really like this image now for the work I'm making that I didn't know I was going to make at the time. Whereas essentially in this case, I'm covered in heather, which is this sort of perennial, sort of low plant that grows in the moors in Scotland. And essentially now I would think of a lot of the sculptures I'm making as if the heather shed its leaves or no flowers, and that a branch without leaves or any sort of like identification. For the average viewer, they don't know what type of plant or tree it is. It could be an oak tree, it could be a pecan tree, it could be a pine tree. It sort of has no race, it has no gender, it has no religion.
The pattern of the heather behind him, fitting into the landscape as had been learned from his forebears, generation to generation. He had conquered the grouse, but something had changed within him.
So this is sort of one of my first sort of wood carving. I made this as, on my couch when I had a live workspace, I don't know, in 2013 or 14, and I had all the wrong tools. But I had an idea. Now, if I remade the sculpture, it would be totally different. And I debated tweaking this, but I guess I'd like it. Showed my sort of amateur approach to carving and this sort of impreciseness. And similar to the pork tenderloin log at the beginning, it was thinking about what if the inside of a tree looked different than you expect. And in this case, just carving away the wood to sort of reveal this vertebrae and these ribs. And some of my, I guess, why I'm drawn to working with wood is because most people in the world have some experience of a tree or a piece of wood that even if you've grown up in the desert, and the tree is even more precious there because of the scarcity. And that somewhat as an artist, I'm interested in sort of if I can manipulate what you think of a piece of wood as something that's super ubiquitous and is often sort of a backseat in many people's lives, if I can kind of subvert how you think of what a tree can be or a piece of wood, it's a way in of transforming, maybe how you think about some of the more conceptual underpinnings in the work. And so and also when I started getting into carving wood, I was making these works called fossil fashion, where essentially I would take I would take successive sizes of clothing. So think of an infant, or think of like a Russian Matryoshka doll, where there's these like little larger figures stacked on top of each other. But essentially I would take clothes and I would start with the baby's clothes, and then I would coat it in plaster, then dress it in the next size up. And then I would cut into it to reveal the growth of the body. Sort of like layers of a tree, or geologically like marble. So in this sculpture here, it's American Apparel clothing. This was like their T-shirt and their California fleece sweatpants, where the black lines are the clothes, and the white is the plaster. And where this is like a person that's been cut into 5 slabs. So the center one here, you can see the toddler, like 0 to 3 month old, like the hem of the bottom of the legs. And this idea of also was American Apparel. They were still in business at that time, but they were going bankrupt. And this idea of fast fashion, and also even the name American Apparel as this sort of what is an American. But also it was one of the only companies that made clothes from like a newborn to a 3X. So this range of body types, and this sort of way of looking at the transformation in a person. And it was really these sculptures that got me into carving wood. And so in this case, it was like their tights and like a baby rib T-shirt. So if you look closely, you can see some of the fabric and the grain sort of coming through. And it was also these sculptures that the work I was making before this focused more on what I now call organs of identification. So if you think of the things that make people different, like skin, their hair, if it's an organism, the leaves, the tree bark, the feathers, they're all what says we're different, versus like looking more internally, things that people share, organisms share. It could, I felt that I could have a wider dialogue that's more expansive. And still it's coming from me as the artist. I think every artist's work, whether they're an abstract whatever, or working in super figurative ways, that everyone's work is very autographical. Like if everyone in this room drew a line with a pencil, it would look totally different. That's sort of a reflection of your life experiences to some degree. So this is me kind of metaphorically sort of ripping open a person. And in this case, this was an earlier sculpture where, again, I went to like a thrift shop and I bought hundreds of clothes, going through the different sizes. And then just with Elmer's glue, layering them together in this way, so that, again, on the right side here, though, you have this sort of the layering, but then it's sort of on the other side. It was loose, so it's this sort of book of someone's life told through clothing. In the short film, I'm this hunter, and it's sort of in this viewing of it I did at Postmaster's Gallery in New York City. I worked with some chefs called Ghetto Gastro to sort of create this meal where the short film is only about 8 minutes, but where you've served a course of food, where in the end you became like a mirror image of what's happening in the film. And so I'm also really interested in eating and being around a table, and like the sort of different social dynamics that can happen when you share a meal with people. Whereas, most people, when you put out free food, they're going to act different. Or they're like, and they're, and just it's a way of bringing people together to sort of share a space. And so I've done what I now call these culinary installations since I was in high school. Typically, they're around my birthday, which is November 12th. And in this case, this is in my apartment where I covered a table with lots of spaghetti. It takes very long to cook this amount of spaghetti. It's a little bit inspired by Lady and the Tramp, except in this case I took imagine the pasta like kitty litter, and that it was like a huge pile of pasta, and there were 5 sauces. So when you got tired of one sauce, you just pile up more pasta, and then put a new sauce on top. And then then it got into this, like creating these like constants and variables. Then how do you create this sort of space around the table that sort of kind of dictates how people will interact with each other? And so in another meal, it was based off of this. It doesn't look so bright in this photo, but there was this fluorescent light tube down the center of the table, which created this situation where it was very bright, and so that you needed to wear sunglasses. There also was typically a uniform, but it created this unusual experience where typically, when someone has sunglasses on, they might be more relaxed because it's also like a mask and people can't see necessarily where you're looking. But at the same time, to another person, you can be intimidating with sunglasses. But it was interesting the sort of social dynamic this created where people were comfortable and uncomfortable at the same time. But it created, creating this situation that around the table that dictated how you or would celebrate how you interact with other people.
Around the table.
And so in the film, I've brought together these birds of prey from around the world to sort of share this meal of grouse. Again, it's this idea of disparate people coming together around the table. And so it's only like afterwards that I started to realize that a lot of my interest in not just eating, but also tables as this sort of sculptural device of what they represent. And another one when I did a residency at Abrams Arts Center, this is a housewarming party where all of the food was intrinsically spherical shape. So whether it was a cheese puff or a hard-boiled quail egg, a Whopper, a cherry tomato, it was just thrown on the table together as a sort of heterogeneous mix of flavors. So at this one, all of they were having a series of these artist barbecues throughout the summer, and so I worked with a local chef to he barbecued like some chicken wings and some quail, and then all these balloons were filled with them. And so there was like a playlist of 90s music and birds chirping. So whenever the birds were chirping, I would hunt them with a skewer. And then they would fall on the table and people would eat the food. And so the food was good. This was a party at a friend's house where it's these helium balloons filled with salad ingredients, and everyone, you were told to wear, well, you could wear camo or like a floral print, and essentially everyone was given a skewer, and there's a table in the center of the room where you could kind of, pop the ingredients onto the table to sort of toss the salad, and it was this, we had to weigh everything, like so that how much helium does it take to make XYZ levitate. And And so typically in a lot of these meals, I've been trying to bring people together, but through some unusual means. But again, it's I guess this interest in social landscapes and interacting with other people. That's a potato salad. Um, and then in this piece, these were some were wedding gifts that I made when I took a ceramics class, like at the 92nd Street Y. And at the time, I actually was working as an architect for Starbucks, and I was really into coffee. And I made these more as like a symbol versus not for someone to actually use. Because when I was giving them to the people, I had to wash them, and I was terrified of breaking them. But I thought that was an amazing idea for bringing people together in this sort of like push and pull of working with someone else. So this was a Thanksgiving meal held at a artist-run art gallery that's no longer in existence, but where essentially I wanted to create this family-style meal of people sharing, coming together at a table, mostly strangers. Somewhere they were involved in the art world or they're artists or something, and they were all. Each person's wrist was attached to two other people diagonally, and they only had about 6 inches of movement, which was where I found the sweet spot of where you became dependent on the other person. And it at first wasn't revealed who you were having an effect on. And so I really like, this dichotomy between this sort of polite behavior above the table, but this sort of resistance underwards. And just as an adult, how awkward it feels to someone to control your eating. This was a dinner I did when I was at Cornell. And it was based off of the only time I did like a spring break trip, I went to visit a friend from high school who's going to the Art Institute of Chicago, and I was gotten really into food, and I was always into food, but I went to this molecular gastronomy restaurant called Modo. It's no longer around, but there was this tasting menu, and like the main, like the big, it wasn't big, but it was little. But it was like a piece of bison, and it had this sauce on it that to me tasted like every cheeseburger I'd ever eaten, and like distilled into this what looked like ketchup. And so I made me want to create a meal, like some sort of dinner where every food was liquid, but like it tasted like this essential ubiquitous like American food that you might have grown up with, like a Chef Boyardee or a banana split or a Caesar salad, and so everything was pureed in advance, and we served through these sort of snorkel funnel devices. Some of they had different liquids, other things mixed with them to make them more viscous or less viscous. So like they had alcohol or milk or broth. This is probably broccoli. Like the caprese salad, and sort of like so it was this fun but also uncomfortable, and like while people's hands were tied behind their back, that they didn't have to swallow the food, but it would stay in their white clothes because there was this sort of dress code that you were supposed to wear at least a white shirt and like black pants or a skirt. And this is another meal where It was initially, this is a restaging of it, but I had a birthday party in my apartment in Harlem. This is after I went to Columbia, and I wanted to have the most possible guest I could accommodate in the apartment, but limited to the size of my living room. So that meant that people would have to sit in the table. So it created this sort of modular table, just a 4x4, where essentially they could come together so that the people in the table would sit on these spinning chairs, and they were kind of family style that they could move around. And then, and it just sort of, but there was dangers that you'd get your elbows in the food and different things. So everything came with its own risk. And then this is a picnic table I made while I was still at Columbia. I guess this was in 2017, and it was in a group show at a park in New York City, in Woodhill Park. And essentially it's made from trees that were going to get mulched, that the Parks Department had cut down. And it's this sort of picnic table that, a picnic table is this sort of democratic gesture at bringing people together in a sort of a public place where you can eat, play games, or do whatever at it. And I left this sort of, what looks like stumps are actually where there were branches on the tree. And I left them there, so they created these sort of obstacles to, sitting or using the table. It was still possible, but they became this thing you had to navigate. And sort of the table became, this sort of maybe the difficulty of sharing a meal with certain people, or also talking about where the tree came from. I often describe the way, the way I use wood. Was like, so looking at this table is like if you like a chicken McNugget is like a puree of like 100 chickens or something, and it's like OSB plywood. That it's like the plywood that looks like mulch. It's a lot of trees that have been cut up and put together, or what's in IKEA furniture. Whereas a 2x4 is like a chicken breast strip, where you kind of you're told it's chicken, but it's an abstraction of what a tree is. In terms of the board. And then a lot of times when how I'm using wood, there's some vestige of where it came from attached to it. So, like a drumstick with the foot still on it. There's some, like, whether it's farm to table or like, there's sort of this idea of there's some like history of the wood and the place it came from, how it grew towards the sunlight, that kind of becomes embedded in the artworks. So this is like this is the first Adirondack chair I've made. I've made a lot of works, well, not a lot, I mean less than 5, but of works with Adirondack chairs, and the Adirondack chair is this sort of typically probably has some form of relaxation, so that you're not like at an office using the chair, you're not at church. It's might mean you own some land or your second home, but sort of that, but here these branches have been sort of carved into these sort of phallic shapes that they're not really, it's in the eye of the beholder what they are, but it's impossible to sit at. And this, and also at this time is when I first made this work called Briar Patch, which was around the time I was graduating from my MFA program. And this was a show I had at White Columns where there were these 6 school desks made out of Christmas trees from Park Avenue that were sort of turned into made this small classroom where it was impossible to really penetrate. You had to crawl on the floor to get underneath it to screw the desks together. And it's called Briar Patch, and this idea of this briar patch is an undesirable place that's dangerous, that in this sort of folk tale the other animals don't want to go in there, but the rabbit is actually able to excel in this place that most people it's off limits, and sort of there takes on this metaphor of education being this place that might keep people out, but it also might provide a protective space where some could flourish, or even people talk about how the branches touching and creating this collective or energy or nerves connecting, but also even like ecological issues. This idea of well, some people see this as it's dying and it's done, or some people see it as an opportunity and that there's some opportunity of growth, and sort of like maybe it's just in the fall or the winter. So all of those ideas I like as a way of looking at this work. And so like the branches aren't attached. A lot of people ask, oh, how is it made? And it's a lot of these sculptures could have been made 5,000 years ago. Like there's no smoke and mirrors really on how they're made. It's not how most things are made, and that typically throughout the history of man, when a tree fell in a forest or was cut down in a forest, to pull it out, they cut off all the branches first, after it hit the ground, because that made it easy to pull out and not get tangled and have to deal with all these branches getting caught on things. But it's so often when you look at a piece of wood that has a knot in it, that's where a branch was. That was growing towards the sun. And so essentially I'm, going through a lot of, there's some labor involved in, creating a board out of from a tree, but also leaving some of the branches attached. But once I get over that part of making these individual boards, I'm able to then reconfigure them together in the conventional woodworking techniques. But where the branch creates this sort of randomness, while the boards are quite, they're a plane, they're this sort of rectilinear prism with flat edges, but the randomness and the organic quality is coming from the branch itself. This is a work I had at the Shed in New York City, where it's a small house. The piece is called Hedges, and essentially it's recreating this kind of archetypal bungalow-style house where it's only half of it's constructed and it's half scale, and the rest of it is seen in a mirror reflection. So it creates this sort of street of all the same house, but at the same time, the branches are 4 or 5 feet long, so you can't get that close to it. And it's also conflating this idea of a home and a bird's nest, and this idea of if you ever walked by a hedge and you hear birds, but you don't see them because they're somewhat camouflaged. But this thing that's protective, but also keeping some people out, keeping some people in, but also this idea of them all being the same, and this sort of this dream or this idea, but also that it's the fantasy, it's a reflection, it's not possible to inhabit the street. And the windows are mirrored, so there's this idea of seeing yourself in the artwork. And earlier on in the presentation, when I was mentioning when I was in the Heather, and that was in 2014, and this sculpture I made 4 years later, and it's made out of Christmas trees, which isn't necessarily for me as important as some significance of them being Christmas trees, but more so living in New York City, you can't just go around cutting down Christmas trees. And around Christmas times, this mass sacrifice of all these trees have been cut down to be in people's homes, and then they get thrown out, and there's this free wood, essentially. If you can afford picking it, you just have to pick it up and move it around. But I was interested in this idea again of this person with no leaves or race or gender or sexual orientation or religion, that this sort of top and bottom, like the upper body and the lower body, could be anyone. Sort of this sort of carving away these bones with the branches coming out. These are 3 pelvises where there's fir, black walnut, and Gabon ebony. This is an earlier piece with made out of ebony. This is Texas ebony, and this was sort of baby crib that has this sort of neoclassical architecture sort of embedded in the look, the design of it with the pediment and the colonnade. But there are thorns that have been carved out of the wood to sort of make it almost like a prison. And so this piece is called America, and it's based off of this. I actually grew up with one of these tables at some point when I was younger, there's not a great name for the type of table. They're typically oak in this sort of orangey color. The type of chair associated with them is called a press back chair, whereas sort of in the turn of the late 1800s, early 1900s, most people, non-wealthy people, had really utilitarian, uncomfortable furniture, and the sort of people who had like carved and more ergonomic furniture tended to be wealthier, and with this sort of innovation at that time, they were able to make what was a press-back chair that the back of the chair and the seat could be, using machines and pressure and steam, could be bent to be a more comfortable chair, but also engraving it with a decorative pattern that's not hand carved. So there was this sort of democratic gesture of bringing people together at a table, and also still this idea of this round table, this nuclear family, husband and wife and their 2 kids sharing a meal together. However, this table, it's not really possible to sit at it, and you can, to me, I think you can be the perspective of the person putting the thorns on, or the person who's not able to sit at it because someone put the thorns on it. However, either way, you can't use the table. It's also made from mesquite, which is a type of wood that grows in the southwest into Mexico. And it's native in Texas, but it's often, people consider it invasive because it can thrive in environments where there's limited water resources and take over. And so a lot of people want to eradicate it because of its sort of perseverance, and a lot that people would prefer an oak tree. It takes a long time to grow, gets big over time, uses a lot of water, but it can't kind of grow under difficult conditions. And so I like this sort of social and cultural sort of histories that a piece of lumber can have, or a tree, in terms of what is it, how political it can be. And while you don't need to necessarily know that this is made out of this wood and how it's been persecuted in parts of Texas and unwanted and is considered like invasive, I think it does add an extra layer and interest to the piece, because you can conflate that with those ideas with people. This is an early map piece that it was based off of the 2016 election results, essentially on how it's segmented, and this is Christmas trees that are actually coated in Neosporin, because Neosporin is this antibiotic cream to help you heal. It's mineral oil based, and most basic like wood finish is mineral oil, except this has this added properties of healing. Who is it helping? The tree is dead. it's moisturizing it? Is it helping someone who's inflicted by it? But I like the idea of making the wood anthropomorphic, and this sort of spiritual quality to that. And so this is getting into sort of these more useful objects I've been making that are unuseful, or difficult. Like a ladder is something that's supposed to help you get higher. But often, whether it's a student loan or whatever house with a mortgage, these things that are supposed to help you can also hurt you or be challenging to use. And this finding a way to navigate is often its own thing. So there's there's different ways of looking at it. Also, making like a beautiful object is also interesting. This is another Adirondack chair with and a side table that also sort of has this tree branches growing out of it, and again this idea of wanting that sort of American dream idea of like blending in, sort of where often a lot of literature, like the forest is this wild place that's dangerous, but for me I think I'm more interested in this idea of a social landscape. And the more ability to blend in, it's this more this attainable the American dream is, and this idea of it's a difficult place to inhabit, but yet it's seductive. This is then a larger version of Briar Patch when it was at Madison Square Park in New York, and essentially it was 100 school desks arranged as sort of different sized classrooms and different lawns to sort of around the park. And this was a day after it was installed and it snowed. This was installed at Dumbarton Oaks in Georgetown in Washington, D.C., which is part of Harvard. And it's a completely different environment where this time the grass was able to grow. And then some of the desks were permanently installed in Sharjah and the United Arab Emirates in a desert. It was really interesting that the piece could take on, different meanings depending where it was. And so, also there's some of the pieces at the Lalmar Sculpture Park in St. Louis, where they're also installed in a more wooded area where they'll be allowed to be overgrown. And also depending on the time of the year, they become visible or invisible. So in this case, it's like in the winter, all the deciduous trees around them have also shed their leaves, so it's unclear. Is it alive? Is it dormant? But for me, there's this hope eventually it will get overgrown and kind of disappear into the landscape. This was another installation called The End, which is also a classroom, but in this case, the desks have 4 of these dodo bird skeletons on them, where they're made out of trees. Like the dodo is extinct. I think there's different ways of looking at it. Conflating a branch with an extinct animal in a classroom environment. I don't want to over-explain it. I think people can see different things into it. This is another work called American Gothic, where again this idea of something that's supposed to be useful, sometimes that becomes a person, objectified into service of others. It's impossible for these two people to eat, to walk. So they have to kind of work in every action they do. And it's sort of this idea of usefulness, and also within this idea of the American dream and perseverance. This was from a show last year, and at the opening, someone told me this reminded her of her grandmother, who was always like working to help their family get to the next place, but never having a chance to take a break herself. And so we so some, like, we handmade the broom and also and remade a mop. There was all these joints. So the sculpture technically is movable, but sort of there's also this sort of skill and craft that comes into learning how to make a broom, because we couldn't just attach a broom to a wooden femur. And so for me, the goal is that you arrive at these sculptures and you just experiencing them as what you're seeing, not less about how it's made, and not to create a mystery, but just sort of that you, as a viewer, you're just like transported into having to deal with what you're seeing. And as a sculptor working in in reality, I think my work is best viewed like in person, not online. And that while we're still sentient beings, I want to like take advantage of being able to sort of use our senses and walk around, and what your depth and your different perceptions to experiencing artwork. And that most of my artworks are difficult to even be 3D scanned, or like an AI or CNC machines or 7-axis robots couldn't recreate them, that at least yet. And so and I think for me that's great, this idea that we are organisms, and there are some things best experienced in real life. This is a suit. It's like a Xenia suit covered in tree bark, and again, this idea of this is sort of the status symbol, or you've made it. You get maybe at the corner office, and this idea of blending into this expectations of a dream. This piece is called Pinocchio. It's from my recent show in London, and it's like a little girl's dress that's covered in pine bark on the outside. And it was sort of based on, I was at a restaurant in Dallas, and there was across from me, the mother had the little girl dressed up this way, and she was poised on the chair, and the mother wasn't even dressed up. But there was a friend coming, and she was trying to impress her, I guess, and the girl, I was just witnessing it because I was sitting across from them. And it just made me think of this idea of expectations that can be put on to a person of how they should perform and what they should be, this sort of attempt to blend into this dream. Also, as an object, I wanted to, if you ever walked around a tree and you see how the roots meet the ground, I was interested in like that sort of similarity with a dress. If you covered a dress with bark and you have that fluting and that sort of organic nature, this idea of, some people ask, did we some way carve it out of a tree? And well, we didn't, but I like that sort of question, because for a lot of people, they don't know how it's achieved. And that just there's that overlap of like what you're experiencing in reality doesn't match like your lived experience, so that makes you question maybe your reality. This is a piece called Eve, where it's essentially a modified anatomical model that has been covered in tree bark. Well, actually, we had to recreate that model, but most people assume we just bought one. But and then the fetus is made out of black walnut, and this sort of idea of whether you see Mother Earth or this sort of some trees are both sexes, or there's different ways of looking at this piece. And also it's also even a commentary on wood grain, that again with one of the earlier pieces I showed this idea of that a plant has a life, in thinking about it in another way, different than just seeing like the inside of a tree, but maybe this idea that it also has a lived experience. And this is a recent piece called Inside Out, another sort of suit jacket with these sort of internalized thorns. This piece is called Invisible Man, like a blazer with these branches coming out of it. Then this is the end, which is not the end of this presentation, but the name of the piece is the end. This is my artwork at the Clark, which, this, often when I'm describing it, not showing it to someone, I say, oh, it's like a large whale's like rib cage is like landed in the forest and there's like branches growing out of it. But this idea of this like large tree that is no longer there. And, and so a lot of people assume it's a dinosaur, which I find I like because of the scale, I guess, which I find interesting because, again, it's like conflating the idea of a dinosaur with a tree and this thing that's extinct. And what I really like also about this work is that it's sited in the forest. In this photo, it's green all around it. It's clear that it doesn't have leaves, but there is the opportunity that in time, well, like right now, there's still some evergreen trees there, but it's more blending in with the other trees that don't have leaves on them. And I also like that you don't have to like pay to enter a museum to come across this. There are some people who are just going there on a hike or a walk, don't know that there's art, and they just come across this. I often say, like, I think one of the best places to experience art is like a Chipotle, like for like a common person who's not paying like to go into a museum, who was just going to get a burrito. Like, the ability of art to transform their like daily experience, sort of that. So typically in public art, there's that opportunity to engage with people who wouldn't ordinarily go to a museum. This is actually at my home. I have started this sort of landscaping project. It didn't start off with a big initiative, but it's now become this growing sort of spiral maze. This is from last May. Just when I was younger, I was in high school, I wanted to be a landscape artist, but that wasn't a profession. There was landscape architecture, and then I had to apply to go to college. I ended up choosing to study architecture because I thought an architect can design a landscape, but a landscape architect can't design a building. No shade to landscape architects, but I did study architecture. But now I'm finally I am an artist who I'm using the landscape, and more so also hopefully becoming this landscape artist. That's my presentation. So, are there any questions? Or?
Yes, we have two microphones, one on this side and one on this side, so we'll take questions.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It's nice to see you again. I guess so this will be the third time you and your art will be in Williamstown, and I'm just curious if there's something that brings you back here.
Well, not guaranteed, but hopefully. Well, I think you all must have good taste here in Williamstown. It is unusual. I've had a lot of projects in Massachusetts. I think that Massachusetts is a very educated place and like academic roots, and also like an interest in nature and landscape and conservation. So I there are some overlaps there in some of my interest, but no, it's really great to be able to engage, share my artwork with the public. Yeah. Go Williamstown.
Can you tell us what material you used in the womb cross section in Eve?
Of the baby is black walnut, like the fetus, but the anatomical model is cast resin that we then hand painted with like an acrylic paint. But then it's covered in cherry bark, which is what you're seeing on the outside.
I was so interested in what you chose to wear tonight. Does it have a relevance to your
Oh, well, I
practice?
sure, yeah. I've always been into camouflage clothes. Like, well, I was into, well, I was into gardening and actually gardening before I was into like camouflage clothing, and just at the time when I started to be able to buy my own clothes, most of like I was interested in like printed technology and fabric, and it was only really affordable and really high-end like runway clothes or camouflage at like Walmart or Dick's Sporting Goods, and that was the first way I got into wearing camo. But then I've just like it, and also I typically wear brown. There was a phase where I only wore brown clothes. This idea was like nude on me, but but yeah, I mean like some people only have black clothes. Maybe they're different shades of black, but I have a lot of like camos and brown clothes, so. and some patterns, yeah.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. I was curious about particularly the outdoor sculptures and how they fare over time. If you're interested in impermanence, you talked about people kind of approaching these pieces, and I kind of imagine someone walking over and breaking like a little twig off of your whale skeleton. So I'm curious about that.
Yes, I mean that's all. Well, typically in like a museum setting, or like it's all about the conservation of the artwork and like how long will it last, and this idea of value. What I really, not all of my the works I've shown are the outdoor works are wood, and part of the idea behind them is that they would eventually have a permanent homes where they are allowed to sort of devolve and be overgrown back in their land and their landscape around them. So that's intentional and part of the piece. So the piece here at the Clark is supposed, it will just disintegrate into the landscape. You know, when it was discovered, that was an economical thing too. It's cheaper to leave it there than to remove it. That also helped. But conceptually, I think it was more important that this idea that there's like a little sapling growing up in it, that it will get over it. If a tree might fall on it, that makes it better. Because that's the concept of the artwork. Likewise with the Briarpatch, the school desk. While they were initially at Madison Square Park, there was no chance they were going to stay there. I mean, it's a small park in the middle of Manhattan, but they were able to travel to different places ultimately, where some of the classrooms were able to sort of, one in the desert and one in St. Louis in the woods, where they could stay there indefinitely. Different climatic things in the United Arab Emirates than in Missouri. But that was part of their piece, the artwork, that I think this is a conceptual intent. It's not just by chance that they were made from ephemeral materials. I have made some outdoor public sculptures. I didn't have any outdoor public sculptures that are made out of metal or bronze, which I didn't include in the presentation. But actually, the first exhibition I was in Williamstown was at the Williams College Art Museum in the Emancipation Show, and where I had a 3D printed plastic sculpture of a man sitting in an Adirondack chair, and there's a life-size version of that sculpture in bronze now in Fort Worth, Texas, where the show originated, in like a public plaza. But it kind of also I was more of a purist earlier in my practice about using I was also probably my architecture education and the conceptual rigor behind every material decision. Now, I mean, there's I've opened up to other possibilities. One is just like bronze as a convention, which isn't always the most interesting, but sometimes. But also, even when I did make the bronze in Fort Worth, my approach to it, I was told from the foundry, was different than how a conventional people are using it in terms of the use of patina on it, so that it could just be more than a finish, but it could have more meaning in how it's used.
Thank you so much for your presentation. First, I have to say how much I love this image of your yard. It is absolutely beautiful.
Thank you.
And then my question is, you went a little bit into the thought behind using mesquite as the wood choice for your dining table and the chairs. Is there like a similar conceptual approach to choosing the wood for your other sculptures, or does it sometimes depend on availability? Like, what's the thought process behind that?
Typically it's, there's some significance to the wood, like the piece, the end that's at the Clark is made out of hemlock that was locally sourced within like a 5 or 10 minute driving radius, so that it's from here. It maybe represents a person here, or it was also a sustainable choice in a way by selecting it. And also typically when if I'm cutting down a tree for artwork, it's done in a way that it's more of like land management, or like thinning the forest, or for like with a more ecological perspective and approach about it. But typically, rarely am I just choosing a wood for its color. Typically, it's not always on the wall label, and there's not always a wall label, but maybe the architect in me, I am really interested in not only the material properties or the structural or scientific properties, but also the cultural or historical properties of the wood. But sometimes some of those things aren't as important. But they're typically, even if I am using wood from Home Depot, I would say that's part of the piece, that it is out of pine or fir that's super ubiquitous and nondescript, that hopefully I'm using it in a way that's telling in the artwork. His name is also Hugh. He was being called earlier, and I was confused because I don't encounter that many Hughes. So.
How's it going, you?
I'm all right, Mel.
You touched on it a couple times there, but I'd love to hear more about just your training as an architect, and like how architecture approaches like building a building versus like how you approach maybe making a sculpture, like where those two worlds collide, or if you fight it, or
well, as an architect, and I wasn't as close to the production of it. Typically architecture is a team, and there's the person who's doing drawings or coming with the ideas, and also the person who's physically doing the work. But there's definitely this, from my architectural education, this idea of that. I would now call it like creative problem solving as almost like an approach to life, and that there's some rigor between every decision that you're making to sort of create a building or make a chair. And I definitely have expanded that process, and even make material selections to making a sculpture. And I guess I have loosened up, because there's often especially when I started off as an artist, or even before I would say I was an artist, you'd always hear people be like criticizing like the architect turned artist as, oh, they're too tight, or like, like you got to loosen up and have like less rules. And so I would say now I am like shedding some of my like strict the system of rules, but there's also some things I think are more important too. So it's sort of I definitely would say it's there in terms of because it kind of organizes my process probably. And it's curious with the gardening, I'm more organic and less about the rules. I mean, sometimes you have to follow rules so it works and it grows. But it also depends how you look at a piece. Like, so a lot of the artworks are made, actually, I do use AutoCAD or SketchUp to figure out where things go together. And that, and how the joinery, but sort of if it has like thorns or branches or some other sort of shaped branch, typically those create this randomness and organic quality, which is embedded in the piece, but it's still following like rules in a system that's pretty orthogonal or geometrical of how it all comes together.
Hi, Hugh. Thank you so much for such a lovely survey of your work. I wanted to ask you about, like, what are the differences maybe of your approach to an artwork, a sculpture, you know, it's going to be in gallery versus a public artwork that might be outside. And also because I was very interested in your like dinner installations and showing these networks between people. Have you thought about possibilities of activating public sculpture in that way?
And the latter part of the, it's curious, a lot of the sculptures I've had outside inevitably get used as some form of engagement of like, with the end, the work at the Clark, I actually, you know, in the first sketch I made, there was someone sitting on one of the vertebrae. There's another piece I had at that's like a lifeboat that has a whale skeleton like carved out of it. As soon as and as well as the picnic table, as soon as we finished the install and I was about to take a photo, someone ran up before me and put their dog on it to take a photo. And so it's sort of, typically it's especially in a park, it's someone with a dog before the baby, but also it's, and a lot of them have been popular with kids too, like the boat piece called the Gulf Stream, and two of the places it was installed, it had an unprecedented amount of kids in it, like wearing away the finish more than was expected, and so it's, you know, it's a different viewer, a different audience, and so it's sort of. And often people will engage with something in a completely unexpected way. A lot of times with like a branchy sort of sculpture, I would be more. In my head, I'm thinking about all the ways someone could try to destroy the artwork. So and there's a built-in like acceptability of like, especially the piece in the woods. It's like, well, if a tree falls on it, I think that actually is conceptually interesting. And even, you know, the choice of the branches are pretty robust. It's going to take a big effort to break them, you know. But if someone goes out there with a chainsaw, I'm not even like, it was not going to work regardless. So it's, you know, I sometimes am critical of this sort of like a sculpture has to perform in a certain way that a painting is not expected. But, you know, if a vase falls, it's going to break. And so, like, but I do think the sculptures are pretty resilient. And specifically the interior pieces that have used branches as well. Typically, there's the amount of branches and the density, they're kind of stronger together than it alone, almost a metaphor for people. And so that... there's you know, it's like walking on nails. If you walk on one, it's going to hurt you. But like on a bed of nails, they kind of spread the weight. They distribute it more evenly. So for a lot of the sculptures, that's helpful to it, that it's like less exposed in a way. What was the first part of your question, though?
Your different approaches between having a sculpture in gallery versus it being a public artwork.
Often it's also scale too, like something I would do outside versus inside, yeah, because also there's there are some other metal sculptures I've made. There's a piece called Boogeyman that was originally shown indoors, but it was made. It looks like a police car with a sheet on top of it, but it has like holes cut out in the eyes, and. Originally we made it so it could go outdoors. It's like stainless steel that's been like, has a nice paint job. So So there was some, but I mean, some pieces are just better suited for for outdoors, depending what they are. So it kind of just depends on the opportunity and what the piece is about. But I don't order, typically making something for outside is some way more expensive in a way. And you needing this, like an exhibition opportunity or space. So I've made less outdoor works just because they're more dependent on needing a home versus something like a smaller, more just domestic scaled artwork that's indoors.
How do you manipulate bark to turn it into sculpture? And do you have some helpers?
To transform, well, so the process of getting the bark, now, I'll fast forward to how we do it now, which is still the same way, but essentially I have some relationships with 2 different sawmills where typically the bark that's on the side of a slab of a tree is unuseful to them. And so we'll go to the sawmill. One is in Princeton, one is in Poughkeepsie, and we just chisel. It's only using cherry or pine bark, and we'll chisel the bark off of the tree because those off of the side of the slab, or if they have logs, because that bark is more flaky in texture, and easy and almost I don't know, like the corn flaky, corn flakes, the cereal, and it's essentially. We chisel it off in big sections, then they kiln dry it for us so that it kills any insects, makes it more temperature stable, and also or if there's any sort of fungus or something, it would kill it. And then it's like a puzzle that we bring it back to the studio, and it's in different sizes, and it kind of processes it more, thinning it out, and then it's just trying to make it look like it grew that way. Like in terms of finding the pieces that will work next to each other. The dress Pinocchio, I do work with assistants depending on what the piece is, and my assistant worked on that for 4 months, like with tweezers, like kind of attaching the bark to the dress to make it look as if it was had grown that way.
Yeah. You've got some on great organic forms and positive and negative space. I was just wondering if you thought about lighting your sculptures, or do they sort of go to bed at night?
If outdoor sculptures?
Yeah.
Well, a lot of the times where they've been displayed, they weren't near light, or their people aren't necessarily there at night. And typically, everyone was concerned more with some of the just making it happen. And but I would love to light the sculptures. With the branchy pieces, I am less into because some people see it and like in an indoor sort of interior show, they want to make it look, like really shadowy and like dramatic. But I'm actually less into that because that takes away from the piece. But I more importantly want it to be seen and not. I didn't actually like bright lights, though. Some people like around me, close to me, think I don't like my taste in lighting, or like the level of like interior light, like a bright white light. So at home, but but if I win this commission, it will be lit, so you can see it at night. Because a lot of these artworks were just, whether they were in temporary locations or they were in a forest, it just wasn't, and they had budgets too for where they just lighting it wasn't really part of the conversation.
So I'm just saying, to put a piece on a college campus that is, right now it gets dark at 5 o'clock at night.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking about near the museum, lighting a piece at night could actually be pretty great to keep it alive.
Oh, totally. I totally, especially on the site where this artwork would go, very prominent just for cars and people. I think that would be great to light it. I guess mainly the here in the forest, it just wasn't of the nature of this idea. It's something you stumble upon. That wasn't possible, but I definitely do like the idea of lighting it at night, just so that it's more especially if it's more visible, like it throughout the day. I mean, throughout the night, throughout the,
Hi. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. I was familiar with your work, your sculpture work, and presented it to my students, but your time-based work was really a surprise and really interesting to me. So I guess my question kind of circulates around how you think about, I mean, you started us off with that short film, and then sort of midway, we had this like great presentation on these happenings and social practice kind of dinners and get-togethers all around the table. And I just thought it was really interesting, you know, hearing you talk about just hearing your material sensitivity to wood and this kind of thread of like reconstituting material, like even how you talked about like the chicken nugget metaphor with OSB plywood. And also, of course, it's interesting hearing you talk about the practical constraints of like public art sculpture. But yeah, you come from this architecture background, there's like a spatial material sensitivity, and there's a social engagement also with how your objects are operating. And yeah, I guess and there's like permissiveness and like accessibility and barring that too, in both how like the thorns and briars function, and then even just like the constraints around the table and like the 6-inch parameter. So I guess I wonder how you're thinking about, yeah, that social practice work that invited curated engagement and permission and not permitting, and if that's a thread that you still see yourself working with alongside your studio practice of object making, if it's still something you're doing or feeds your work.
Yeah, a lot of times people are like, that sort of topics you're mentioning, they say the combination of them creates something humorous, which isn't to be funny or humorous isn't necessarily typically what I was going for, but I think in hindsight I see that as sometimes the lived experiences of other people can be surreal to you if it's something you're like unfamiliar with. If sometimes you're going to laugh at it, or it's the sort of, you know, seeing someone slip on ice, it can be funny at first, but then you want them to get hurt. But I think it's somewhat just this idea of the lives of other people, or like a different way of looking at the world, or from an alternative perspective, that's often conflating different perspectives from the. But at the same time, some of my sculptures can be celebrated by people with opposing viewpoints because they could see their ideas reinforced, or they could see that as a visualization of what's wrong with the other people.
We have time for one more question.
Yes, thank you so much for your talk. This is more of a practical question about materials, but as an amateur woodworker myself, untrained, I'm wondering about your choice of mineral oil for finishing versus something like walnut oil or other nut oils. Like, how do you think about, finishing your woodwork, especially in your outdoor sculptures?
The majority of my work is unfinished. There was definitely a period of time because also typically the sort of woodworking I like taught myself or not grew up doing, but that I have been doing is a little more non-traditional, or the level of sanding was also not enough to apply a traditional finish. So I started thinking about a finish like using Neospore and a cocoa butter more for anthropomorphic qualities, like conceptual reasons, than really being about the like, not to say the preservation of the wood, but they took on a more conceptual significance. However, on some newer sculptures, say the past 2 years where I've worked with more assistants, and the sculptures have been more like sanded, we've used some more traditional wood finishes, but typically that don't change the visual appearance of the wood, where it's more about preservation and UV block, or mitigating people touching it. It's more. Only have I really made one sculpture recently that has more of a looks like some sort of gloss, like a dining room table finish, which we had to kind of redo 3 times to get it there, because it needed, part of the piece was that it looked like this sort of table someone bought. But I typically I've avoided getting into that, like, not the minutia, but like into this like really like fetish finish. I hate when people say that, but like the because I don't want that to overtake the work, which is a little bit, I'm like kind of recalibrating how many assistants I work with, and because and also how much work, being more involved in, like, well, it's a choice not to sand something too. And so also relative to the scale of the piece. Typically, my work's the smaller the piece, the more attention to detail it has. And often it's taken longer to make, like, per square inch than a bigger piece. Thanks for having me.